The Appalachian Mountains hold secrets in their fog, and one of those secrets begins with a gate. A rusted iron gate, still standing today, creaks against the wind as if whispering to anyone who dares to come close. Beyond that gate lies the remains of an orphanage, once a sanctuary for lost children, now a ruin swallowed by silence. But here's the horror. Dozens of children entered those gates, and no one knows how many ever left. Imagine being a child, taken from the cold towns or abandoned by families crushed under poverty. You'd be promised safety, food, and shelter. Instead, what awaited was a place where innocence went to die. The first step inside those gates was the first step into something far darker than an orphanage. Locals still say the air changes the moment you cross that threshold. The smell of wet moss thickens, the fog hangs heavier, and even the birds go quiet. Some swear the gates themselves groan in protest, as if the land doesn't want you to remember what happened there. This wasn't just a building, it was a trap. A trap for children no one would ever search for, children whose names could be erased as easily as chalk on a blackboard. And that's why the story of this place is so dangerous. It's not just about what happened, it's about how it was allowed to happen. Why did so many vanish without a trace? Was it disease, abuse, ritual, or something so monstrous the community itself chose silence over truth? The deeper we go, the more we realize this isn't just a ghost story. It's a crime scene that history deliberately buried. And here, where you, the viewer, come in. Because the more we peel back the layers, the more disturbing the truth becomes. You'll have to decide. Were these vanishings a result of human cruelty or something even darker, rooted in superstition and power? But let me leave you with this first haunting image. The gates still stand, rust bleeding down like old wounds, and every gust of wind that rattles them feels like the voices of children crying to be heard. So ask yourself, if you walked through those gates, would you make it back out? This was no orphanage, it was a trap. Dozens of children entered, no one knows how many ever left. The gates themselves groaned like they wanted to keep you out. The orphanage wasn't just a house, it was a fortress. Built in the late 1800s, its walls weren't designed for comfort, but confinement. Locals said the stone was quarried from the mountain itself, pulled from rock that had witnessed centuries of blood feuds and untold tragedies. From the very beginning, this building carried the weight of death in its bones. When you stand before its crumbling frame today, it feels less like a ruin and more like a tomb. The walls, blackened with time, sweat moisture even on the driest days. Step close and you'll smell it, the damp odor of rot and stone, as though the orphanage is exhaling its secrets into the air. Here's the chilling twist. Records from the town council show the land was cursed long before the first stone was ever laid. The ground belonged to an abandoned church, one that was shuttered after whispers of blasphemy and forbidden rituals. Some locals swore that when the church was torn down, the foundation wasn't destroyed. It was simply buried under the new construction. And here's the detail that sends shivers down the spine. Old blueprints hint at sealed passageways beneath the orphanage, tunnels that perfectly align with where the church once stood. As if the orphanage wasn't built to shelter children, but to hide something far older. Imagine being a child staring up at the looming building for the first time. Its Gothic windows didn't welcome you, they watched you, black and hollow. The doors groaned when they opened, the iron hinges screaming as if warning you to turn back. But you wouldn't turn back. You had nowhere else to go. The townspeople whispered that the orphanage was a building older than sin, not because of its age, but because of what it inherited. Sin leaves stains, and this place was drenched in it before the first child ever set foot inside. And the strangest part, the head mistress who ran it insisted that the walls were holy, that the children inside were safe because they were protected by the strength of the stone. But protected from what? Or from whom? So here's the question you have to ask yourself. If the land itself was tainted, Did the evil start with the orphanage? Or did the orphanage simply carry on the curse that had already begun? Because as we'll soon uncover, children didn't just vanish here, they were swallowed. Swallowed by a building that seemed designed for one thing: silence. This was a building older than sin. The foundation wasn't destroyed, it was buried. These walls weren't for safety, they were for silence. Every town has its secrets, but in Appalachia, secrets tend to linger like fog, heavy and unyielding. The orphanage's foundation wasn't just laid on stone, it was laid on whispers, and those whispers pointed back to something unholy. Before the orphanage rose, the land belonged to a small wooden church. At first glance, it seemed like any other chapel serving the coal-mining families scattered across the mountains. But the deeper you dig into the old records, the stranger it gets. Parishioners vanished without explanation. Sermons were held at midnight instead of Sunday morning. And when the church finally closed its doors, locals didn't hold a service. They held a cleansing, burning relics and sealing what they called the devil's ground. But here's the part that rattles investigators even today. When workers cleared the church's remains to build the orphanage, they didn't destroy the underground passages. They covered them. Sealed tunnels, damp and endless, still exist beneath the orphanage ruins. Maps from the late 1800s line up almost perfectly with the cracks and collapses in the earth today. What was hidden below stayed hidden, until children began to vanish above. Survivors who lived near the orphanage remember something strange: the way the building breathed on cold nights. They swore you could hear air rushing through unseen passageways beneath the floors. Some said it was wind. Others claimed it was the sound of prayers or screams trapped in the tunnels. Here's a chilling detail. In 1923, a farmer digging a well less than a mile away hit something unexpected: a stone passage. On the walls, scratched into the rock, were crude drawings, crosses, circles, symbols no one recognized. But worst of all, tiny handprints, burned into the soot of the stone. Did the orphanage inherit the sins of the church? Or was the orphanage deliberately built to continue them? That's the question that has haunted historians for decades. Because evil doesn't vanish when you bulldoze a building. It seeps into the earth and it waits. Imagine a child being led down into those tunnels by candlelight, the smell of mildew suffocating them, the walls sweating with condensation, the flicker of flame throwing shadows that move too fast, too wrong to belong to anything human. And then silence, because those who entered the tunnels didn't come back. And the worst part, the head mistress insisted the tunnels didn't exist. She called them rumors. But locals knew better. When the ground itself is cursed, denying it doesn't make it safe. It makes it more dangerous. So I'll ask you, if the past was already poisoned, what chance did the children have once the orphanage was built on top of it? The orphanage wasn't built on holy ground. It was built on whispers. Evil doesn't vanish when you bulldoze it. It waits. Those tunnels swallowed children whole. The strange events at the Bender property didn't stop with whispered suspicions or the odd behavior of its owners. Neighbors began noticing something far more sinister. Travelers who stayed the night at the Benders Inn often never reached their destinations. At first, this was dismissed as the natural dangers of the frontier. Robbers, wild animals, or the brutal weather of Kansas could easily swallow a man whole. But then the pattern grew too strong to ignore. Entire families vanished, their wagons abandoned along the road. Horses would be found grazing freely, but the people themselves were gone, as if the earth had swallowed them. What made matters worse was the Benders' carefully constructed charm. Kate, the so-called psychic, was especially skilled at disarming travelers. She would invite them in with warm words, speaking of spiritual healing and the power of communication with the dead. To the weary and desperate, her promises sounded like salvation. Behind her soft tone, however, lay a trap set with deadly precision. The Bender men, John S.R., and his son, were often seen sharpening their knives, their movements deliberate as though waiting for something. Neighbors told later how their eyes were dark and lifeless, a hollow kind of stare that made even the bravest men uneasy. Some said they had the look of people who already lived with blood on their hands. And then came the worst sign of all: dogs. Travelers who passed by the Bender property claimed they heard animals growling at night, clawing at the dirt as though trying to uncover something buried beneath the soil. Those who dared to ask about the sounds were met with Kate's eerie smile and John S.R.'s thick, guttural threats. Still, the community hesitated. To accuse a family outright was dangerous without proof. The frontier was a place of fragile trust. Neighbors had to rely on one another. But as the disappearances mounted, suspicion hardened into fear. The name Bender began to carry weight, a whispered warning spoken around campfires. If you stop at their place, you may never come out again. The Bender's Inn was no longer seen as a shelter. It was becoming a shadow, a place where life and death blurred. And the truth was far darker than anyone yet dared to believe. It started with a smell. At first, the townsfolk thought it was just the sour tang of stagnant water drifting off the nearby creek. But as summer stretched on, the odor grew heavier, almost sweet, clinging to the air like a curse. Parents walking past the orphanage would wrinkle their noses, pulling their children close, whispering about rot and death. One night, under a bruised purple sky thick with thunderclouds, two local boys snuck onto the grounds. They had dared each other, laughing at first, until the laughter died in their throats. Because in the orchard behind the building, the earth looked disturbed, fresh dirt, roughly patted down. And worse, stray dogs had gathered, growling low, digging with frantic paws. The boys swore later that they saw something pale in the soil, like the curve of a child's hand reaching out. They ran, screaming into the night, their voices echoing through the mountains. The next morning, their parents demanded answers. The orphanage staff denied everything, claiming the boys had overactive imaginations. But whispers spread quickly through town. Were the missing children buried right here on the grounds where they once played? The fear became unbearable when another child, a little girl named Eliza, disappeared just days later. She had been laughing in the yard one evening, her blonde braids bouncing as she skipped rope. The next morning, her bed was empty, sheets neatly folded, as though she had simply walked away into the night. Wait, what? Beds neatly made, orphans vanishing, bodies possibly hidden underfoot. The story twisted darker than anyone in town dared admit. Parents who had placed their children here began demanding them back, but the matron stood tall, cold as stone. She claimed the children were being transferred to other institutions. Yet no records of transfers ever appeared. No papers, no witnesses, just silence. Imagine being a child in that building at night, lying in bed, listening to the creak of footsteps in the hall, praying that the door didn't open. Some said the orphans stopped crying at night, because crying only made the matron come faster. And when she came, someone's bed would be empty by dawn. This was no longer just an orphanage. It was a hunting ground. The children didn't run away. They were erased. Beds neatly made, but the children gone. Buried in their own playground. Could you imagine? If you were a parent in this town, would you storm the orphanage? Or stay silent in fear of what you might uncover? By the time Eliza vanished, the town had reached its breaking point. Fear had turned into fury. Mothers who once spoke in hushed voices now marched through the streets, torches blazing against the Appalachian night. Fathers clutched rifles, their boots pounding the dirt roads like war drums. They were no longer asking for answers. They were demanding them. When they reached the orphanage, the storm overhead cracked open, rain pouring down in sheets, turning the yard into black mud. The building loomed like a beast, windows dark as if hiding something unspeakable. Lightning flashed, revealing the matron standing at the doorway, her frame tall, rigid, her face as cold as a stone statue. She did not flinch. She did not retreat. Instead, she raised her voice above the storm, declaring the children were safe, transferred to better homes. But her words rang hollow. For in that moment, thunder wasn't the only sound. Faintly, from deep inside came the muffled cries of children. The crowd erupted. Men surged forward, shoving past the matron, their boots stomping through the warped wooden floors of the orphanage. The smell hit them first, that same sickly sweet rot that had haunted the town for weeks. Women gagged, pulling scarves to their faces. The lightning revealed water stains dripping down the cracked walls, broken toys scattered on the floor, and then something worse. In the cellar behind a locked door they found it. A line of tiny shoes neatly placed along the wall as though in some grim display. Blankets piled in corners, stained and damp. And on the far side the faint scratching sound. When one man forced the door open with the butt of his rifle, they saw wide, terrified eyes staring back at them. Children alive but gaunt, pale, too weak to speak. They had been hidden away like secrets, waiting for something. Wait, what? The missing children weren't just gone. Some were alive, hidden in the dark, while others, God only knew where they lay. The discovery should have been a relief, but instead it deepened the terror. Because for every child they found, there were others unaccounted for. The matron's face twisted as she was dragged into the mud, her silence more chilling than screams. Some whispered she was only a pawn, following orders from someone higher, someone unseen. The storm raged on, lightning splitting the sky as if the heavens themselves bore witness. That night, the townsfolk thought they had uncovered the truth, but they were wrong. What they had stumbled upon was only the beginning of a nightmare that stretched far beyond the orphanage walls. Behind the locked door, children were waiting in the dark. The matron wasn't afraid of the storm. She was afraid of what the town would find. Some children were alive, but where were the rest? If you broke into that orphanage and heard children crying in the dark, would you dare open the door? When the storm broke and the matron was dragged out, the townsfolk thought they had seen the worst. But deep inside the orphanage, beyond the cellar where frightened children had been discovered, one man found something that chilled him to the bone. It was a ledger, leather-bound, heavy and smelling faintly of mildew and iron. The ink had bled in places from dampness, but the words were still visible. Names, dozens of them, each belonging to a child. At first, it seemed like a normal record, but then they noticed the marks beside each entry. Some names were crossed out with a single line. Others were circled, annotated with strange symbols, almost like coded instructions. And then there were the blank spaces, lines where names had been written and then violently scrubbed away, as though someone had tried to erase them from existence. The townsfolk whispered among themselves, their voices trembling. Were these the missing children, the ones who had vanished without a trace? And if so, what did the symbols mean? One father claimed the markings resembled old shipping codes, the kind merchants used when exporting goods out of the Appalachians. But goods weren't being shipped here, children were. Wait, what? Could it be possible that the orphanage wasn't just hiding children but selling them? The thought spread through the crowd like wildfire. The matron, still silent, offered no denial. She simply stared, her lips trembling but locked shut, as if a greater fear bound her voice. And then came the darkest detail of all. Tucked inside the ledger's back cover was a folded scrap of paper, written in a hand that was not the matron's. It listed dates, and beside them names of faraway towns. Richmond, Charleston, Cincinnati, each paired with numbers, and one of the dates was tomorrow. The townsfolk realized in horror. Another transfer was scheduled within hours. Children, their children, were about to be taken away, never to return. The storm outside grew louder, rattling the windows as if the world itself was warning them. That night the townsfolk swore to guard the orphanage, to let no child vanish again. But even as they set up watches, torches flickering in the rain, a terrifying question hung in the air. If the matron wasn't acting alone, who else was behind this? And how far up the chain of power did this conspiracy go? The ledger wasn't for records, it was for disappearances. Children's names crossed out, circled, erased. This wasn't an orphanage, it was a marketplace. If you found a ledger with erased names and coded marks, would you believe it was just bookkeeping or proof of something darker? The ledger should have been the end of the mystery, proof enough to shut down the orphanage forever, but instead it opened a darker door. That night, while the townsfolk kept vigil around the building, one man sat hunched over the ledger by lantern light. He was a storekeeper, familiar with shipping routes, and the symbols stirred something in his memory. Each circle, each number looked like old freight codes, but freight was never picked up at an orphanage. Unless, of course, the cargo wasn't goods at all. At dawn, he followed the trail. With two other men at his side, he traced the coded numbers to the old rail yard at the edge of town. The tracks were rusted, weeds twisting through the ties, but one platform was cleaner, swept, as though used recently. And on the ground, half buried in the mud, lay a doll. Its glass eyes stared upward, rain streaking down its porcelain face. Someone had dropped it in a hurry. The men searched deeper and found wooden crates stacked behind the depot. The stench hit them immediately: mildew, straw, and something far more nauseating. The crates were empty, but inside were scraps of fabric that looked like they had once been clothing. Tiny shoes, a ribbon, a button torn from a child's coat. Suddenly, the truth clawed its way into their throats. The children weren't just vanishing. They were being shipped out like merchandise. Wait, what? The orphanage wasn't the final destination. It was only the collection point. The real nightmare stretched far beyond Appalachia. But as they pieced it together, another chilling realization struck. The ledger's most recent date, the one scheduled for today, meant another pickup was coming. And if that was true, someone would be arriving at the rail yard soon. Not to bring children, but to take them away. The men raced back to town, the ledger clutched tight, their voices hoarse as they shouted warnings. The townsfolk gathered, terrified but determined. For the first time, they understood the orphanage wasn't acting alone. This was a network, a machine that consumed children and left only silence behind. Lightning flashed again over the mountains, and in that violent illumination, fear turned to rage. The townsfolk swore they would uncover whoever was coming for the children, even if it meant facing men with money, power, and guns. Because if they didn't stop it now, every child in the Appalachians was at risk. The crates weren't for goods, they were for children. A doll in the mud, the only clue left behind. The orphanage was just the beginning. If you discovered crates that once held children, would you wait for the authorities, or take justice into your own hands? The townsfolk didn't have to wait long. By dusk, as the storm clouds rolled low over the mountains, the distant sound of wheels echoed across the rail yard. A lantern swung from the lead cart, glowing like a predatory eye in the mist. The people of the town crouched in the shadows, their breaths sharp, hearts pounding. This was it, the moment when the faceless conspiracy would finally reveal itself. The cart creaked to a stop by the platform, and three men climbed down. They weren't locals. Their clothes were too fine, their accents too polished. These were city men, Richmond, maybe even Washington. The kind of men used to giving orders, not taking them. They carried no crates, only a leather satchel, heavy enough to jingle with coins or something worse. One of them barked an order into the dark, and that's when the matron appeared. Bound in rope, she had been dragged by the townsfolk, but when her eyes met the strangers, she suddenly began to thrash, screaming through her gag. Not in fear of them, but in fear of what they might do if her silence broke. That reaction told the town everything they needed to know. She wasn't the mastermind. She was their servant. The men opened the satchel. Inside were papers, contracts, receipts, and a list. A fresh list of children's names, ready for transfer. The handwriting matched the one in the orphanage ledger. It wasn't just a record, it was an order form. Wait, what? The missing children were not lost. They were delivered, bought, and sold like cattle. The townsfolk rose from the shadows, torches flaring. For a moment the strangers looked startled, then furious. One reached inside his coat, pulling a pistol, but the fathers of the town had come armed too. Rifles cocked, voices roared. The air shook with tension, the storm above answering with a growl of thunder. The strangers didn't beg, didn't explain. Instead, one of them smiled, a thin, knowing smile that froze the blood of every man and woman watching. He whispered, You have no idea how far this goes." Then, without another word, they turned back toward their cart, moving with the arrogance of men who believed they were untouchable. The townsfolk had caught the faces behind the disappearances, but they hadn't stopped them, not yet. That night the people realized they weren't just fighting to save their children. They were fighting a machine, vast, unseen, and more powerful than they ever imagined. The orphanage was never the end, it was the beginning. They didn't beg, they smiled. This wasn't kidnapping, it was a transaction. If you uncovered powerful men trading children like property, would you risk your life to expose them, or stay silent in fear? But just when you thought this nightmare couldn't spiral any deeper, the Benders unveiled their most chilling trick of all. Imagine walking into their cabin, a fire crackling in the hearth, the scent of fresh bread luring you closer, and a warm smile from Kate, the so-called angel of mercy. It all felt safe, too safe. And that was the trap. Behind that innocent table a curtain hung, not for decoration, but for deception. The Benders had engineered their home into a death chamber. The table was placed directly over a trapdoor, a hidden gateway to hell. Guests were coaxed into sitting with their backs to the curtain, never realizing that at any moment John Bender SR or his towering son stood silently behind them, holding a hammer or axe. And then crack! One brutal swing, skulls split open without a single warning. Victims didn't even get the chance to scream. Their lifeless bodies were dragged through that trapdoor, dumped into the cellar where the dirt drank their blood. Some victims were stripped of money, jewelry, and belongings, while others were tossed into shallow graves around the orchard. The Benders' farm wasn't just a home, it was a cemetery disguised as paradise. The chilling part, travelers didn't vanish instantly. Weeks later, their wagons were spotted abandoned, their horses sold in nearby towns, but nobody connected the dots. Because who would ever suspect a smiling family of German settlers, with their polite manners and prayers before meals, of being cold-blooded killers? But soon, suspicion started to build. Rumors spread across the frontier. Stories of missing travelers began piling up like rotting bodies in the earth. Neighbors whispered that the Benders asked too many questions about wealth, about where people were headed, about whether anyone would miss them if they didn't arrive. And yet, every time someone dared to suggest foul play, Kate would host another seance, pulling townsfolk into her dark mysticism, promising them visions of safety and health. She knew exactly how to twist fear into silence. But the truth was clawing its way out. Horses without riders, families that never returned home, and the trail of disappearances all pointed to one place, the little wooden cabin of the Benders. It was only a matter of time before the mask cracked. The year was 1873, and the tension in Labette County was boiling over. Families were disappearing at an alarming rate, yet no one dared to accuse the Benders outright. They were respected in the community, or at least feared enough to be left alone. But then came the disappearance that shook everything. Dr. William York, a man too powerful, too connected, to simply vanish without consequence. Dr. York wasn't just another traveler. He was a respected physician, a Civil War veteran, and the brother of a Kansas state senator. When he went missing, the entire frontier lit up in panic. Search parties were organized, and this time, the Benders couldn't hide behind their smiles and prayers. The York family sent dozens of men, armed and determined, riding through the countryside like a storm, and every clue dragged them closer and closer to the Bender cabin. Farmers in nearby towns whispered, "We saw York pass this way, but never beyond the Bender property." That single detail was enough to spark suspicion into certainty. When the posse finally rode to the Bender home, the family was calm. Too calm. Ma Bender insisted they knew nothing. Kate offered to summon spirits to help locate the missing doctor. But behind their faces was something more, something almost mocking, as if they knew they were one step ahead. The men searched the house but found nothing. No blood, no bodies, no evidence. Just that same innocent dining table and that strange curtain. The Benders smiled and swore their innocence, and the posse left empty-handed. For a moment, it seemed the killers had won. But fate wasn't done. Days later, neighbors noticed something eerie. The Bender cabin stood silent. No smoke from the chimney, no horses in the barn, no figures tending the orchard. The family had vanished overnight. When locals stormed the property, what they uncovered was beyond horror. The ground reeked of death. The cellar beneath the trapdoor was soaked in blood. And when they dug into the orchard, shallow grave after shallow grave began to emerge. One by one, the bodies of missing travelers were dragged into daylight, their skulls caved in, throats slit, their final meals still in their stomachs. And among them was Dr. William York. The discovery was an earthquake. The legend of the Bloody Benders wasn't just rumor anymore, it was carved into the earth itself. But the killers, they were gone, not a trace. No tracks, no bodies, no arrests. Just the chilling silence of a family who had murdered dozens, then disappeared into the shadows of history. The question that haunted Kansas for decades: where did the Benders go? The discovery of the Bender graves should have ended the nightmare, but instead, it ignited one of the greatest manhunts in American history. And here, where the story twists into something even more terrifying, the killers were gone, swallowed by the darkness, leaving only blood and bones behind. The Kansas plains buzzed with fury. Hundreds of men saddled their horses, vowing to hunt down the Benders. Rewards were offered, posters nailed to trees, sheriffs swore they would bring justice. But every trail turned cold. Witnesses claimed to have seen them boarding trains, riding wagons, even hiding in the woods. Some swore the family split apart, each member vanishing in a different direction to cover their tracks. One chilling theory spread fast. Vigilantes had already caught them. Some believed that an angry mob cornered the Benders in the wilderness, lynched them on the spot, and buried their bodies in unmarked graves. But if that was true, why didn't anyone ever speak of it? Why weren't their corpses ever displayed as proof? Another version whispered through taverns was even darker, that the Benders were protected. That powerful men who once dined at their table, men with secrets of their own, helped them escape in exchange for silence. Maybe the Benders didn't vanish at all. Maybe they were hiding in plain sight under new names in new towns, blending back into society like wolves dressed as sheep. And then came Kate Bender, the most infamous of them all. For decades, reports surfaced of psychic women across America who bore a striking resemblance to her. In Michigan, a fortune teller was arrested, only for locals to swear she was Kate. In Texas, a woman matching her description was dragged into court, but witnesses couldn't agree. It was like she became a phantom, haunting America wherever she went. The longer the Benders went uncaptured, the more they transformed from fugitives into legends. Parents warned their children that the Benders might still be out there. Travelers feared lonely inns, terrified of sitting with their backs to a curtain. And every new disappearance in the Midwest sparked the same whispered question: was it the Benders? The truth, no one knows. Not then, not now. The Benders slipped into the shadows so completely that history itself couldn't pin them down. But the bodies they left behind, the graves in that orchard, stood as undeniable proof of what they were capable of. And the fact that they escaped justice made them even more terrifying, because monsters are scary enough when they're caught. But when they disappear, when they could be anyone, anywhere, that's when they become legends of fear. When the truth about the Benders finally spilled into the open, the town of Cherryvale was never the same again. Imagine being a farmer whose children once played near that lonely inn, or a merchant who once shared bread at the Bender table. Suddenly, every memory felt poisoned. The neighbors who once smiled politely had turned out to be butchers in disguise. Trust shattered overnight, leaving behind only suspicion, fear, and whispers in the dark. The survivors of families who lost loved ones to the Benders were broken in ways words can barely capture. Wives were left without husbands, children without fathers. They didn't just lose people, they lost their sense of safety in the world. Walking past the orchard where the bodies were dug up meant hearing echoes of screams buried in the soil. At night, dogs barked at nothing, as if sensing the evil that had once stalked the land. And then came the guilt. Some locals admitted they had suspected the Benders for months but said nothing. A few even confessed they'd avoided the inn because of an uneasy feeling but never warned others. That silence became unbearable, a curse that lingered on their conscience. Could they have saved lives if they had spoken sooner? The question gnawed at them until their dying days. The younger generation grew up haunted by the legend. Parents would warn their children, "Stay away from strangers or you'll end up like those poor travelers." Schoolboys dared each other to sneak near the abandoned cabin. They said the ground still reeked of rot, that at night you could hear the thud of Kate Bender's mallet swinging again and again. Whether those stories were real or not didn't matter. The fear was real enough. But the scars went deeper than ghost stories. The community itself fractured. Neighbors turned against neighbors, accusing each other of being accomplices. Some swore the Benders had help, supplies, information, maybe even protection. Fingers pointed, friendships collapsed, and long-standing families abandoned the area altogether, unable to live in a place so tainted by blood. And here's the most chilling part. Decades later, when descendants of the victims visited, they described the land as cursed. Crops never seemed to grow right near the site. Horses refused to plow the earth. Even travelers avoided the road that ran by the old inn. It was as if the ground itself rejected life after swallowing so much death. The Benders didn't just kill people, they killed peace. They killed trust. They killed the very soul of the community. And for those left behind, that was the cruelest wound of all, because it never healed. The discovery of the bodies in the Bender orchard sent shockwaves across Kansas and beyond. But for lawmen and townsfolk alike, one question burned hotter than any other. Where were the Benders? Sheriffs from neighboring counties spread out across the frontier, scouring trails, rivers, and train stations. Bloodhounds were brought in, but every lead collapsed into dust. Wagons were tracked to nowhere, footprints vanished in the tall grass, and witnesses offered stories so conflicting that investigators couldn't separate fact from rumor. Some swore the family had split, others insisted they were seen together boarding a train to St. Louis, and a few whispered the most haunting theory of all, that the Benders never left Cherryvale alive. One farmer claimed he found bones in a field nearby, too small to be cattle, too weathered to be recent. Could they have been the remains of the Benders themselves? If so, who killed them? An enraged mob, neighbors seeking vigilante justice, or perhaps someone powerful who wanted to erase any loose ends? Here, where the conspiracy deepens. A few townsfolk muttered that the Benders had been tipped off before the search began. That someone, maybe a sheriff, maybe a businessman with blood on his hands, warned them just in time. If that's true, then the Benders weren't just killers. They were part of something bigger, a network of silence and secrets buried beneath Kansas soil. As months passed, every new arrest brought hope, only to end in bitter disappointment. In 1889, nearly 20 years later, two women were arrested in Michigan and accused of being Kate and Ma Bender. The trial made headlines across the country, crowds packed the courthouse, and survivors swore they recognized them. But in the end, the evidence fell apart. The women walked free, and the legend of the vanishing killers grew darker still. The investigation stretched across decades, with sightings reported as far as Texas, Colorado, and even Mexico. But every time the law closed in, the Benders slipped through their fingers like smoke. The frustration of lawmen was almost as chilling as the murders themselves, because it suggested that justice, even when pursued with fury, might never catch evil once it learns to hide. And yet the hunt never truly ended. Every sheriff who rode the plains at night knew the same gnawing thought. What if the Benders are still out there? What if the next lonely cabin, the next smiling family of innkeepers, hides the same secret? What if evil doesn't die? It just changes its name. The manhunt for the Benders grew so desperate, so frenzied, that it stopped feeling like justice. and started looking like hysteria. The prairies of Kansas turned into a hunting ground, not just for fugitives, but for anyone unlucky enough to resemble the murderous family. Vigilante groups sprang up overnight. Farmers who had never fired a gun before now rode the plains with rifles strapped across their backs, swearing they would find the Benders or die trying. Every wagon on the road became suspicious, every family of travelers a possible disguise. Innocent people were dragged from their homes, questioned at gunpoint, even beaten into confessions that weren't theirs to give. Rumors fed the flames. One group swore they found Ma Bender hiding in a cave. Another claimed they caught John Jr., working as a blacksmith in Arkansas. Each rumor brought mobs roaring to life, only to end in humiliation when the accused were proven innocent. But the damage was already done. Lives were shattered, reputations destroyed, and in some cases, innocents simply disappeared, swallowed by the same paranoia that once shielded the Benders. And then there was the story no one wanted to admit out loud, that vigilantes had caught the family in secret. Some claimed they were hanged from trees deep in the woods, their corpses left to rot as a warning. Others whispered that the mob didn't stop at killing them, that they tortured the Benders first, forcing confessions, extracting the names of supposed accomplices, before burning the bodies to ash so no one would ever know. If that's true, then justice wasn't served in the light of day. It was buried in the shadows, leaving behind a trail of silence more unsettling than the crimes themselves. Because if the Benders died at the hands of vigilantes, then the community itself became the executioner, sacrificing law for vengeance. And vengeance never truly satisfies. Psychologically, this frenzy revealed something terrifying about human nature. People who had once lived in peace with their neighbors were now capable of unthinkable violence. The Benders hadn't just murdered travelers, they infected the entire community with fear, suspicion, and bloodlust. Evil had spread like a plague, and no one was immune. By the end of that summer, Cherryvale was scarred. Families avoided strangers, wagons passed each other with narrowed eyes, and travelers dared not stop at lonely inns again. The hunt for the Benders hadn't just failed, it had turned everyone else into reflections of the killers they feared. Because sometimes the scariest part of a story isn't the monster that strikes first. It's how quickly ordinary people can become monsters themselves when terror takes hold. The manhunt eventually cooled, but the terror never left Cherryvale. Instead, it twisted into something darker, something that seeped into bedtime stories, warnings, and whispered legends passed from one generation to the next. Children were raised on fear of the Benders. Parents didn't need fairy tales of wolves or witches, they had something far worse and far more real. Mothers would hush their children at night with warnings. Don't stray too far or the Benders will find you. Fathers would point to the lonely road and mutter, that's where travelers vanished. For the children, it was impossible to separate fact from folklore. For the adults, it didn't matter. The fear itself was enough. The abandoned inn became the centerpiece of this legend. Some swore that after dark, you could still hear Kate Bender's voice, chanting her false prayers through the wind. Others whispered that the floorboards bled if you cut into them, soaked forever with the lives they had stolen. Travelers reported seeing flickering lanterns through the empty windows, though no one had lived there for years. Dogs refused to go near the ruins, their howls cutting through the prairie night like echoes of the murdered. But the stories didn't just terrify, they also infected the town with shame. Cherryvale was forever branded as the home of the Bloody Benders. Merchants worried outsiders wouldn't trust them. Families feared their children would be stigmatized just for living in the shadow of the killers. Some locals tried to erase the past, tearing down the Bender Inn, plowing over the orchard, pretending it had never happened. But history is stubborn. You can bury wood and bones, but you can't bury memory. Psychologists today would call it generational trauma. The survivors had lived through betrayal so profound that the smiling neighbors who offered food and shelter were actually butchers, that it shattered their ability to trust. That fear filtered down into their children and grandchildren, shaping a culture where paranoia ran deep. A knock at the door was no longer just a knock. It was a possible trap. A stranger asking for water was no longer just a traveler, it was a threat. And here's the eerie truth. The legend grew stronger the more it was told. Every retelling made the Benders larger than life, until they weren't just a family of killers. They were the embodiment of evil itself. They became America's own boogeymen, proof that monsters didn't live in forests or under beds. They lived across the road, behind smiling faces, waiting for the moment you let your guard down. That's the real horror of the Benders. Death fades, but fear lives forever. As the years rolled on, the Benders stopped being just fugitives. They became a business. Newspapers discovered that every mention of the bloody Benders guaranteed attention, sales, and outrage. The legend spread far beyond Cherryvale, morphing with each retelling, until no one could tell where fact ended and fiction began. Headlines screamed of Bender sightings from Illinois to Mexico. Some claimed the family had been spotted in Europe, hiding among immigrant ships. Others insisted Kate was still alive, living under new names, luring men into seances with her hypnotic voice. Each story sold papers, and each story deepened the paranoia that the Benders could be anywhere. But it wasn't just the press cashing in. Conmen and imposters began exploiting the legend. A woman in Michigan posed as Kate Bender, charging money for readings and stories, until suspicious locals dragged her before the courts. In Texas, another woman was nearly lynched when townsfolk were convinced she was Kate in disguise. Whether innocent or opportunist, these figures fed the fire, keeping the Bender myth alive. And then came the ghost hunters. By the late 19th century, spiritualism was booming in America, and the Bender Inn was treated like sacred ground for the macabre. Mediums claimed to speak with the murdered travelers, describing visions of blood-soaked earth and screams that never ended. Curious visitors trekked to the site, daring each other to walk the orchard where the graves had been dug. The air, they said, always felt colder there, as if the land itself refused to forget. Psychologically, the Benders had become more powerful in absence than they ever were in life. By disappearing, they gave people permission to project every fear, every suspicion, onto their legend. They weren't just killers anymore. They were shapeshifters, specters, symbols of betrayal and doom. But there was another, quieter layer to the conspiracy. Whispers that the Benders had been protected. Some stories claimed powerful men in Kansas had used the inn themselves, politicians, sheriffs, landowners. If the Benders were captured alive, maybe too many secrets would spill out. And so perhaps they were allowed to escape or were silenced in secret, their deaths hidden to protect reputations. The result? An endless cycle of speculation. The more newspapers printed, the more ghost stories spread. The more sightings were claimed, the less anyone knew. And in that fog of half-truths and conspiracy, the Benders ceased being a family at all. They became a curse, a phantom stitched into the fabric of American folklore. And the scariest part, every retelling wasn't just about them. It was about us, our hunger for blood-soaked stories, our need to believe in monsters, and our fear that evil might be closer than we think. The Benders' disappearance left behind a hole that conspiracies rushed to fill. For some, it wasn't enough to believe the family slipped away under the cover of night. No, the truth had to be larger, darker, and far more sinister. Whispers spread that the Benders weren't acting alone. Could four people really murder so many travelers without help? Some suspected neighbors had quietly provided supplies. Others pointed to the local sheriff, who had dined at the inn more than once. Did he really not notice the missing travelers? Or did he choose not to? Even more unsettling was the rumor that politicians themselves had visited the Benders' table. These were powerful men who could not afford scandal. If the Benders were caught alive, what secrets might have spilled? What names might have been dragged into the mud? Suddenly, the idea that the killers were tipped off or even smuggled out of Kansas by influential hands didn't seem so far-fetched. Then came another theory, that the Benders weren't a family at all. Some claimed John S.R. and Ma weren't husband and wife but fugitives themselves, bound together by crime. Kate, the so-called daughter, might have been a conwoman who joined later, using her charm and psychic powers to lure in victims. In this version, the Benders were less a bloodline and more a murderous gang, connected by greed rather than family ties. But the darkest conspiracy suggested something broader, that the Benders were part of a larger web of killers stretching across the Midwest. In the years following their disappearance, other reports of murder-ins surfaced in Illinois, Missouri, and Texas. Were these copycats inspired by the legend? Or were they accomplices, connected to the Benders by some hidden network of travelers and thieves? Every theory added another layer of fear. If the Benders had accomplices, then who else was hiding behind a smile and a dinner plate? If powerful men had silenced the truth, then maybe justice was never meant to be served. And if the Benders were still alive under new names, then maybe evil had simply moved into the house next door. The conspiracies didn't just explain the mystery, they made it worse, because the truth, whatever it was, remained locked in silence. And silence is the most dangerous conspiracy of all. Protected by power. Murder in network. Truth buried deep. Do you think the Benders escaped because of luck, or because someone powerful wanted them gone forever? When the Benders vanished, their crimes didn't just end, they multiplied. Soon after their disappearance, other families and roadside inns across the Midwest began to draw suspicion. Every time a traveler went missing, whispers followed. Another Bender house. It didn't matter if there was proof, fear had already written the script. In Missouri, a family running a tavern was accused of luring guests into traps. In Illinois, an innkeeper's sudden wealth made neighbors question how so many travelers passed through his doors, yet never seemed to be seen again. Even in Texas, isolated farmhouses gained reputations as murder dens. The legend of the Benders became so infamous that any unexplained disappearance could be pinned on their cursed legacy. Some historians argue this wasn't coincidence. They suggest the Benders created a blueprint, a way to make money from death, hidden under the guise of hospitality. After all, who suspects kindness when it comes with a meal and a bed? Perhaps other criminals borrowed the idea, turning the murder inn into a repeating nightmare across America's frontier. But others believed something darker, that the Benders themselves were still alive, running these very establishments under new names. Each rumor of a blood-soaked cabin or suspiciously quiet farm became another possible hiding place. The Benders are here, people whispered in frightened towns, just wearing new faces. This fear twisted into folklore. Mothers warned their children never to trust strangers on the road. Newspapers sensationalized every discovery of hidden graves, always tying it back to Kansas, even if there was no real link. In a way, the Benders had become immortal, not through survival, but through the fear they left behind. What made the legacy even more haunting was its unpredictability. A traveler could step into a warm, welcoming home and never walk out again. That uncertainty was the curse the Benders left behind. The idea that evil didn't wear a mask, it smiled, it served dinner, it poured you coffee. Every copycat murder, whether connected to the Benders or not, fed this terror. The legend spread so wide that the term Bender House became shorthand for a place where kindness was a trap. Even long after the family disappeared, their shadow fell across America's highways, reminding everyone of the invisible danger waiting just behind a friendly invitation. The blueprint of murder. Every road leads to fear. The curse of the Benders. What's scarier to you, copycats who admired the Benders, or the chilling possibility that the real Benders lived on, hiding in plain sight? The prairie should have returned to peace after the Bender family vanished, but instead it was left with a hollow silence, an emptiness that screamed louder than any storm. Neighbors who once laughed under starlit skies now locked their doors and whispered at night, fearing shadows that stretched too long. The orphanage's grim connection to the Benders was never spoken of openly, but everyone knew. The walls of that place seemed to breathe, as if the voices of vanished children were trapped inside, crying for justice that never came. Here lies the cruelest twist of all. The crimes of the Benders were not an isolated horror. They became a contagion, a dark blueprint for others. The missing children from the orphanage weren't simply forgotten. They became part of a story Kansas wanted erased. People claimed to see figures wandering the fields at dusk, tiny handprints smudged on fogged glass, or the sound of children's footsteps when no child was near. The silence was not safety. It was denial. Newspapers grew quieter, officials shrugged, and rumors were buried under dust. And yet, silence can never truly hide evil. It only feeds it, gives it more room to grow in the cracks of memory. The people of Kansas thought they had survived the storm, but the storm had simply moved underground. Wait, what if the orphanage itself wasn't just a place of lost children, but the perfect cover for darker dealings? Food for travelers, shelter for the vulnerable, and an endless supply of victims whose names would never be missed. The thought burned in the minds of locals, a horror too big to voice out loud. Generations later, descendants still refuse to talk about it. The land remains barren and the buildings long gone, but ask the old families and they will tell you something unnatural clings to that soil. The silence is its own warning. Sometimes history doesn't forget, it waits. The orphanage where evil never died. When silence screams louder than murder. Haunted land of the forgotten children. Would you dare walk across land where silence hides more screams than storms? Years after the Bender family disappeared, travelers passing through Kansas began to whisper about a strange ruin on the edge of the prairie. It was said to be the remains of the orphanage, its walls cracked, its roof caved in, but locals swore they could still hear voices inside. On quiet nights when the wind stopped, a child's laughter echoed faintly through the empty halls. Sometimes it wasn't laughter at all, but sobbing, desperate, pleading, impossible to explain. The people who dared to explore reported something far stranger. Furniture left untouched, as if abandoned in haste, small shoes lined neatly by the door, and faded portraits of children whose eyes seemed to follow intruders. But the most chilling detail, journals half burned with only fragments of words remaining. Taken silence, never return. These scraps fueled a terrifying theory, that the orphanage had never been a safe haven but a hunting ground. Every story grew darker with retelling. One farmer swore that when he leaned against a wall, he felt something breathing on the other side. Another man claimed the bricks themselves pulsed, as if soaked in blood that never dried. These weren't just ghost stories. They were warnings, kept alive by families who wanted their children to stay far, far away. But wait, what if the whispers weren't from ghosts at all? What if survivors, children who escaped, hid within those ruins, too scared to reveal the truth, too broken to face the world? Some locals believed they were there, shadows darting between walls, leaving the faintest signs of life. If true, that means the orphanage wasn't just haunted by memory, it was haunted by survivors left behind. The tragedy of the orphanage was that its story was never fully written. It became folklore, mystery, fear, all blended into a tale Kansas itself wished to bury. Yet, ruins have a way of keeping secrets alive. The walls that once confined children may still whisper to anyone who dares to listen. The walls that still whisper names. When children's laughter turns to screams. Orphanage ruins that refuse to die. If you stood inside those ruins at night, would you believe the whispers, or run before they spoke your name? Among the ruins of the orphanage, one artifact stirred more fear than any ghost story, a half-burned ledger discovered by chance during a demolition attempt in the early 1900s. At first glance, it looked like any old registry, names, dates, and ages of children taken in. But as investigators flipped through its brittle pages, they noticed something horrifying. Dozens of entries ended abruptly, without signatures, without destinations. Children simply disappeared from the book, as if they had never existed. Some names were crossed out with thick black ink, others faded into smudges. Beside a few, there were cryptic notations, Transferred, promised, gone. None of the destinations matched official records, and in the margins, written in shaky hands, were chilling phrases like, "God forgive us and no return." The deeper they read, the colder. The air seemed to grow, as if the ledger itself carried the weight of hundreds of vanished voices. The most terrifying twist: some of the names listed matched missing children from surrounding towns, cases that had long gone cold. Families had been told their children ran away, were adopted, or died from sickness. But the ledger revealed another story: a hidden system, a quiet conspiracy where orphans were not protected but processed and then erased. Wait, what if the ledger wasn't just a record but a contract? Some historians believe it hinted at deals struck in the shadows, children promised to farm owners, traveling traders, maybe even worse. To those who studied it, the evidence was clear. The orphanage was less a sanctuary and more a marketplace for the forgotten. The ledger vanished soon after discovery. Officials claimed it was lost in fire, but locals whispered it was destroyed to protect powerful names. And so the truth of those children, whether they were sold, sacrificed, or simply discarded, remains sealed in ash. Yet even now, some descendants of townsfolk claim the names in that book still echo. They swear that on certain nights, they hear children calling from the fields, as if still searching for the lives stolen from them. The ledger may be gone, but its curse remains, to remind us that silence can be more deadly than screams. The ledger that erased innocent lives. Children vanished without any goodbye. The orphanage that sold its own. If this ledger was found today, do you think it would expose forgotten crimes, or be buried all over again? The discovery of the orphanage ledger should have changed everything. It should have sparked arrests, trials, and justice for the missing. Instead, it vanished, quietly, efficiently, as if someone powerful had been waiting for it all along. Officials in Kansas declared the ledger irretrievable, destroyed in an accidental courthouse fire. But locals knew better. Fires don't start themselves in locked evidence rooms. Whispers spread of judges, sheriffs, even local politicians who had ties to the orphanage. Some had donated land or money, others had signed adoption papers that led nowhere. These weren't random disappearances. They were systematic, coordinated, protected. The orphanage wasn't just a house of horrors. It was a machine, feeding children into the hands of those who profited from their silence. One chilling rumor suggested the Benders themselves had allies in high places. Their inn had been a perfect trap because no lawman ever questioned their constant stream of missing travelers. Could the same protection have shielded the orphanage? Imagine an unspoken deal where children and wanderers were simply currency, bartered away under the cover of law. Wait, what if the ledger's disappearance wasn't about shame at all but survival? If the names inside linked directly to respected families, families who still hold power today, then burying the truth would be the only option. Generations could crumble under the weight of those revelations. The cover-up extended further than burned papers. Reporters who tried to push the story found themselves discredited or driven from town. One journalist, Thomas Everett, wrote in 1912 that he believed the orphanage deaths were sanctioned by men in uniform. Weeks later, his body was pulled from a river. Official cause: suicide. Locals never believed it. The conspiracy was simple, brutal, and effective. Erase the records, silence the witnesses, and call it all a ghost story. And it worked. For decades, the orphanage faded from memory, replaced by prairie myths and whispered curses. Yet the silence of authority speaks louder than words. When governments bury evidence, they aren't protecting the dead, they're protecting themselves. Today, descendants of those families still avoid the topic. Ask them about the orphanage and their faces harden. Some deny it ever existed, others change the subject. But silence is an answer in itself. And when silence protects the guilty, it damns the innocent forever. The ledger burned, the truth survived. When power protected the predators. The conspiracy that buried children alive. Do you believe powerful families would burn history to protect their names, even if it meant burying hundreds of lost children? The conspiracy around the orphanage might sound like a nightmare buried in the 1800s, but history has a cruel way of repeating itself. Even today, we hear stories of institutions meant to protect the vulnerable turning into hunting grounds for the powerless. From modern-day child trafficking rings to church scandals and political cover-ups, the orphanage's dark shadow stretches across centuries. Think about it. Hundreds of children went missing without trace and officials erased their names. Fast forward to the 20th and 21st centuries, orphans in state-run facilities, children in foster systems, even wards of the church. Again and again, we find patterns of abuse, disappearance, and silence. Different uniforms, different titles, but the same betrayal. One haunting parallel is the infamous case of the baby scoop era in the mid-1900s, where children of unmarried mothers were taken and adopted out, often without records or consent. Another is the Canadian residential school system, where Indigenous children vanished in staggering numbers, their graves only now being uncovered. Wait, what if the Appalachian Orphanage was just America's earliest version of this same pattern, a prototype of systemic disappearance and sanctioned silence? The ledger may be ash, but the pattern is undeniable. Institutions thrive on trust, but in every age that trust can be weaponized. The orphanage was trusted to protect, yet it became a marketplace of pain. Modern scandals show the same story. The most vulnerable are treated as invisible, their suffering buried under paperwork, excuses, and fires that always seem to burn the wrong files. Cinematic detail lingers. Imagine the smell of charred paper rising from a courthouse fire, the acrid smoke mixing with whispers of names no one dares repeat. Imagine, decades later, the cold stone of a government office where survivors beg for answers, only to be told there are no records. The silence is the same. The betrayal is the same. Only the names and uniforms change. The orphanage didn't just vanish. It became a blueprint for how the powerful protect themselves while the powerless disappear. And here's the most terrifying question. How many similar ledgers are still hidden, in dusty basements, locked archives, or private collections, waiting to be destroyed before the truth can escape? Yesterday's orphanage, today's hidden scandals. The blueprint evil still follows. When institutions become hunting grounds. Do you think the orphanage was just the beginning, and are we still living with its blueprint today? Long after the orphanage crumbled into dust, the land refused to rest. Travelers described strange sensations when passing by, an icy chill crawling up their spines even on the hottest Kansas day. Horses would buck, wagons would stop, and modern cars sometimes stalled without explanation. Locals whispered of a curse, that the cries of the forgotten children had seeped into the soil, poisoning anyone who dared to ignore their suffering. The stories were endless. A farmer claimed he heard a lullaby drifting across his fields, soft at first, then rising into a chorus of wailing screams. A family who built a home near the ruins swore their children would wake screaming at night, pointing toward the empty prairie, crying, "They want us to come play." Even seasoned hunters refused to cross the land after dark, insisting that shadows moved against the moonlight, darting like children running just out of sight. One chilling tale tells of a group of teenagers who broke into the ruins in the 1970s. They brought flashlights, beer, and laughter, but they didn't leave the same. One girl was found outside the ruins, trembling, muttering the same words over and over. "They wouldn't let us out." The others never spoke about that night again. But the most disturbing twist came when paranormal investigators visited the site in the 1990s. Their equipment recorded unexplained EVPs, faint voices repeating phrases like "lost, alone, help us." When replayed, some voices sounded like children, others like adults. Was it the victims, or their captors, still haunting the orphanage's ashes? Wait, what if the curse wasn't supernatural at all but psychological? Generations of silence, cover-ups, and fear created a collective memory so heavy that people began to feel it in the air, projecting their own guilt onto the land. Either way, the effect was real. No one could stay there without feeling watched. Even now, locals warn outsiders. Don't build there, don't camp there, and above all, don't listen to the voices. Because once you hear them, the curse follows you home. The land where children still cry. Haunted by the orphanage that burned. The curse that never let go. Would you dare spend a night on cursed land, where vanished children are said to still whisper? When word of the Bender murders spread beyond Kansas, the entire town of Cherryvale was swallowed by shame. People whispered in saloons, eyes darting, as if speaking too loudly might summon the ghosts of the family themselves. Some locals swore they had seen signs long before, odd deliveries of tools, strange noises at night, but they chose silence. And now that silence had blood on its hands. Newspapers called Cherryvale a town of cowards. Headlines screamed that neighbors had ignored the evil brewing under their noses. Farmers who had once prided themselves on hospitality were branded complicit. And the cruelest twist, many believed townsfolk had secretly helped the Benders escape. Rumors spread of covered wagons slipping out under moonlight, guided by men who wanted this nightmare erased, not solved. Court hearings followed, but the evidence was weak, scattered, and tainted by fear. Survivors of the victims' families demanded justice, but every name called to the stand stumbled into contradiction. One sheriff insisted he saw the Benders cornered near Texas. Another man swore he helped bury their bodies in the woods. None of it matched, yet all of it burned into public imagination. The town was left with a curse of its own. Cherryvale became infamous, a place branded not by what it built but by what it ignored. Travelers avoided its inns, trade slowed, and the whispers never stopped. The people had wanted to bury the story, yet the more they tried, the darker and louder it grew. Even today, Kansas folklore remembers Cherryvale not just for the killers it bred, but for the chilling truth. Sometimes it isn't only the murderers who are guilty. Sometimes the entire community wears the blood. The town wasn't innocent, it was complicit. Silence can kill louder than knives. The Benders vanished, but the shame never left. If your neighbors harbored monsters, would you speak up or stay silent? For decades after their disappearance, whispers of the Benders kept America on edge. Newspapers from Texas to Wyoming ran stories of supposed sightings, each one more chilling than the last. One farmer in Nebraska swore he saw Ma Bender working at a roadhouse, her piercing eyes exactly as he remembered from the wanted posters. In Colorado, a prospector claimed he drank with John Jr. in a saloon, laughing about slitting a man's throat as easily as a pig. And in Missouri, an entire posse cornered a couple they were sure were Kate and her brother, but the law set them free when witnesses faltered under pressure. The most shocking twist came in 1889 when a Kansas woman was arrested for horse theft. Locals recognized her instantly as Kate Bender. She denied it, of course, but when asked about the murders, she smiled. A cold, knowing smile that left the courtroom frozen. Without conclusive evidence, she walked free, leaving behind a haunting question. Was justice slipping through their fingers yet again? Each supposed capture turned into a spectacle, drawing thousands who wanted to glimpse America's first family of serial killers. But the truth was always just out of reach. Were these real sightings, or the ghostly shadows of a legend too terrifying to die? The sightings never stopped, fading only as memory turned into myth. And with every passing year, the Benders became less like fugitives and more like specters, forever haunting the edges of America's frontier. They vanished, but the world kept seeing them. Every shadow was Kate, every laugh was John. The Benders became America's living ghosts. If a killer disappeared today, would you ever believe they're truly gone? By the turn of the century, the Bender legend had transformed into something almost theatrical. Traveling carnivals and dime museums displayed wax figures of the bloody Benders, charging a nickel for the chance to stare into their glassy eyes. Vendors sold lurid pamphlets with exaggerated stories, some claiming the family had butchered 50 victims, others insisting Kate performed satanic rituals before each killing. One carnival even built a replica of the Bender cabin. Visitors stepped through a creaking wooden door and saw a table laid with rotting props, a trapdoor smeared with painted blood, and mannequins posed mid-murder. Screams filled the air as actors in prairie clothes jumped out, playing Ma with her hammer and John Jr. with his wild laugh. But beneath the laughter and cheap thrills, there was an unease. Survivors of the real murders sometimes wandered into these shows, trembling as they relived the horror. One woman fainted when she saw the wax figure of Kate, claiming it looked too real. The carnival world didn't just entertain, it kept the Benders alive in the American imagination. Children grew up hearing stories of the family who killed travelers. Parents used their names as warnings. Don't talk to strangers, or the Benders will get you. The line between fact and fiction blurred. The more the story was twisted, the stronger the legend grew. It no longer mattered whether the Benders were dead, alive, or ghosts. What mattered was the fear they left behind, a fear so powerful it became a sideshow attraction. The Benders turned into carnival nightmares. People paid to see murder reenacted. History blurred with horror under the circus lights. Would you pay to see a killer's crimes turned into a carnival show? By the 1910s, the prairie around Labette County was no longer silent farmland. It had become haunted ground in the minds of locals. Travelers swore that at night, when the wind howled through the tall grass, they could hear the faint cries of the Benders' victims. Horses balked near the old property, refusing to cross the earth where the orchard once stood. Some said the trees themselves bore twisted knots in their trunks, like faces frozen mid-scream. Campfire tales grew darker with each retelling. Children dared each other to walk past the property after sunset, whispering that Kate's ghost wandered the fields, lantern in hand, luring lost souls to their doom. Farmers reported strange lights flickering over the land, blue, unnatural flames that no storm could explain. Others claimed to hear hammering in the dead of night, as though Ma Bender was still at work, swinging her weapon over and over. The unease wasn't just superstition. Locals avoided building homes anywhere near the site, even when the land was offered for free. Men who tried to plow the soil often abandoned their work, muttering that the ground was wrong and their cattle grew sick. By the 1920s, the site had become a place of pilgrimage for thrill-seekers, journalists, and occultists. They described the prairie as unnervingly quiet, as if nature itself refused to forget. The Benders had vanished, but their legend had mutated into something far more dangerous: fear that lived in the land. Whether ghost, curse, or simply memory, no one could shake the feeling that the prairie itself had absorbed the screams and was waiting to release them again. The ground where screams never died. People swore the prairie was cursed. Ghostly lanterns still wandered the night. Would you dare spend a night where the Benders once killed? By the 1930s, nearly 60 years after the murders, whispers of the Benders' survival still refused to die. Every few years, sheriffs, bounty hunters, and amateur detectives launched the final hunt, determined to end the mystery once and for all. Old women in rural towns were dragged into court, accused of being Ma or Kate Bender in disguise. Bearded drifters were chained and interrogated, questioned if they were John Jr. or the elder John who had simply changed his name. One infamous case unfolded in 1934 when two elderly women were arrested in Michigan, accused of being Ma and Kate. Their trial drew national headlines. "The bloody Benders found," screamed newspapers. Crowds gathered, desperate for justice after decades of frustration. Witnesses swore they recognized Kate's cold eyes and Ma's hunched frame. But after weeks of testimony, the case collapsed. The women were released, their names ruined, their faces forever tied to a legend they had nothing to do with. Yet these false arrests only fueled the fire. If these women weren't the Benders, then where were the real ones? Had they crossed the border into Mexico, as some claimed? Had they joined traveling circuses under false names? Or had they melted so deeply into society that their children grew up never knowing their parents' bloody past? The so-called final hunts always ended in failure, but they served a darker purpose. They reminded the public that the Benders were never truly caught, that anyone, an old farmer, a wandering fortune teller, a widow in a small town, could be hiding one of America's most notorious killers in plain sight. The fear was no longer just about ghosts in the prairie. It was about living faces in the crowd. Faces that might smile, nod politely, and then, behind closed doors, be the same ones who once swung the hammer. They dragged strangers to court as Benders. The final hunt never caught them. Any face in the crowd could be a killer. What's scarier to you, ghosts that haunt or killers who blend in with us? By the mid-20th century, the Benders were no longer remembered as just killers. They had become something far more terrifying. Symbols of the darkness America tries to bury but can't forget. Teachers used their story as cautionary tales, warning children not to trust strangers. Writers twisted the legend into pulp horror, painting the Benders as demonic creatures instead of flesh and blood killers. By the 1960s, horror films borrowed their imagery. Isolated farmhouses, hidden trapdoors, the smiling family who invites you in but never lets you leave. But while Hollywood dramatized the Benders, the prairie still carried its own whispers. Visitors to Labette County described the earth as unusually dry, as though the ground itself had been scorched by evil. Hunters claimed their dogs refused to track near the site, howling uncontrollably. Farmers said their crops rotted faster when planted too close, as if the soil rejected life. Then came the strangest stories. People who spent the night near the land spoke of shared dreams. They claimed to see a cabin standing whole again, firelight glowing through its windows, shadows moving inside. Some woke up with scratches across their arms or the lingering smell of iron and blood in their nostrils. Skeptics laughed it off as imagination, but believers swore it meant the Benders weren't just killers. They were a curse woven into the prairie itself. And here lies the darkest truth. Sometimes killers die, but their stories live so loudly they never really go away. The Benders blurred the line between history and horror until no one could tell where fact ended and nightmare began. That's what made them immortal. The Benders became America's nightmare fuel. Visitors swore they dreamed inside the cabin. Evil doesn't vanish, it roots itself in the soil. Do you believe places can hold evil, even after the people are gone? The strangest thing about the Benders' legacy is not just the brutality of their crimes, it's the silence that followed. No justice, no graves, no confessions, just an open wound that never healed. That's why, even today, the story refuses to die. It doesn't just belong to history, it belongs to us. Psychologists point out that unsolved crimes leave behind a special kind of fear, the fear of what if. What if the killers were never caught? What if they lived long, ordinary lives, shopping in town, raising children, blending into society like shadows? That uncertainty digs into the human mind and never lets go. It's why the Benders haunt us more than any murderer who faced a trial. Because with the Benders, the ending was stolen. And here's the modern connection. Every generation has its Benders. Families or individuals who look perfect on the outside, but hide monstrous secrets behind their walls. We've seen it in cults, in small-town scandals, even in political dynasties that collapse under the weight of hidden crimes. The Benders are not just a relic of the 1870s. They are a warning that evil doesn't always come wearing chains. Sometimes it wears a smile. Imagine being one of their neighbors, sharing meals, exchanging greetings, only to discover that the family next door was slaughtering travelers in secret. That paranoia never fades. It's the same paranoia people feel today when a quiet suburb discovers a serial killer lived among them. History changes, but the psychology of fear remains exactly the same. And that's why the Benders' story matters. It forces us to ask the most chilling question of all. How well do we really know the people around us? The Benders stole the ending of justice. Sometimes evil wears a smile. The scariest killer is the one you never catch. Could your neighbors be hiding secrets darker than you can imagine? There's a saying in Labette County that justice delayed is justice denied. But in the case of the Benders, justice wasn't just delayed, it was erased. And that erasure left behind something darker than punishment ever could, a curse. Generations after the murders, locals whispered that anyone who tried to profit from the Benders' story would meet misfortune. A journalist in the 1940s who wrote a sensationalized book about them died suddenly in a car accident before it could be published. A carnival operator who built a traveling Bender house of horrors went bankrupt within months. Even tourists who took soil from the Bender property as souvenirs claimed to suffer nightmares, illness, or worse. Of course, skeptics laugh at curses. They say it's coincidence or human imagination at work. But those who have stood on the ground where the orchard once grew know it feels different. The air hangs heavier. The silence is oppressive. And when the wind rushes through the grass, it almost sounds like whispering voices, accusing, mocking, reminding everyone that justice never came. The real curse of the Benders isn't supernatural, it's psychological. It's the knowledge that a family of murderers simply vanished, absorbed into the crowd, escaping the fate they deserved. That reality gnaws at the collective mind, leaving a wound that never fully heals. And maybe that's the point. The Benders thrived on fear while alive, and they continue to thrive on fear in death. The curse is not in the land or in the bones buried beneath it. The curse is in us, the living, because we are forced to remember what happens when evil is never confronted, when justice is forgotten, when killers simply walk away. The Benders' curse wasn't death, it was silence. Justice erased became the true horror. The real curse lives in us. Do you believe curses are real? Or is the real curse living with unanswered evil? By the late 20th century, the land where the Bender cabin once stood had been reclaimed by nature. The orchard was gone, the cabin torn down, and only fragments of stone hinted that anything had ever stood there. To a passerby, it looked like any other patch of Kansas farmland, quiet, ordinary, forgettable. But those who knew the history said the silence was too deep, too absolute. Hunters reported that no birds sang near the site, as though the air itself refused music. Farmers swore their cattle grew restless when driven past the spot, eyes rolling white, muscles trembling. It wasn't just empty land, it was hollow land, like the earth had swallowed its own voice. And yet tourists still came. They came in the 1970s, in the 1980s, and even today, drawn by the magnetism of horror that never dies. Some came to lay flowers for the victims. Others came to steal bricks, wood, or soil, clutching it like cursed treasure. And every visitor walked away with the same unsettling feeling, that the story wasn't finished. That's the true terror of the Benders. Not the hammer blows, not the hidden graves, but the silence after, the lack of closure. The fact that even after a century the final chapter has never been written. The killers were never punished. Their bones never accounted for. Their voices never silenced. The land keeps its secret, and the silence screams louder than any gunshot ever could. The cabin is gone, but the silence remains. Empty land holds the loudest screams. The final chapter was never written. What's more terrifying to you, blood on the ground or silence that refuses to die? More than a century has passed since the Benders vanished, but their shadow has only grown longer. Their story has become part of America's bloodstream, retold in novels, echoed in movies, and whispered in classrooms as a warning. But why does this single family of killers haunt us more than countless others? Because they left us with no ending. Every great horror story has a climax where the monster is slain, justice is restored, and the nightmare ends. But the Benders denied us that moment. They melted into the crowd, leaving behind nothing but bones in shallow graves and a silence that never lifted. That absence of justice, of closure, is what keeps the legend alive. Even today, writers and filmmakers return to their tale because it represents something universal: the terror of evil hidden in plain sight. A smiling family, offering you dinner, inviting you into their home, and then vanishing without consequence after spilling blood across their floorboards. That image is primal. It taps into our deepest fear, that safety is an illusion, and the people we trust most may be the ones sharpening the knife. And perhaps the most chilling part: somewhere in the branches of family trees across America, descendants of the Benders may live unknowingly, their bloodline carrying the whispers of a nightmare. It's not just history anymore, it's inheritance. That's why the legend refuses to die. Because it's not just about them, it's about us. About how we confront evil when it slips through our fingers. About how stories of violence don't fade, they evolve, mutating into warnings, myths, and curses. The Benders live on because fear is immortal. The Benders stole the ending and gave us a legend. Fear is immortal, and so are they. The scariest story is the one without an ending. Do you think the Benders, descendants, walk among us today, carrying their cursed bloodline? After more than a century, the Benders' story is still whispered in the wind that sweeps through Labette County. Tourists, historians, thrill seekers, they all arrive seeking answers. They leave with questions, because the truth is not just hidden, it's forbidden. No bodies were ever fully accounted for. No confession exists. The family vanished without trace, leaving behind only fragments: a cabin foundation, an orchard overgrown with weeds, and a prairie soaked in fear. Some historians insist the mystery is solved, pointing to distant sightings or death records, but local folklore says otherwise. It says that every shadow could be Kate, every rustle in the grass John Jr., and every quiet farmhouse may harbor Ma herself, still waiting. The most chilling aspect: those who tried to dig too deep, journalists, treasure hunters, even amateur ghost hunters, often report nightmares, sudden illness, or a sense of being watched. Some disappear for days, only to return pale, shaking, refusing to speak of what they saw. The land itself seems alive with memory, a silent witness to the evil that once walked its soil. Wait, what if the Benders weren't just killers? What if their story represents something far larger: the darkness humanity is capable of hiding in plain sight? The fear they instilled continues because the truth is uncomfortable. Sometimes evil can't be buried, and sometimes justice isn't meant to be found. And here, the forbidden truth the historians won't admit: the Benders did more than murder. They created a legacy of terror, paranoia, and silence that transcends their deaths. Every story, every warning, every thrill-seeker's anecdote is a testament to their enduring power, a reminder that some histories are meant to be feared, not forgotten. The Benders vanished, but terror remains. Some truths are too dangerous to uncover. Evil doesn't die, it waits silently. If you uncovered the Benders' final secret, would you share it, or would you fear the consequences?